What do you think? I got a new shirt here. Take a look. Abe Lincoln is my homeboy. I've got a bunch of those, but most of them are worn out. Not many people wear Lincoln shirts. Anyhow, this is a commentary on the discussion from last week, which was really interesting. I could tell the way all of you went back and forth that it really captured your interest as well. And what I liked about it was, if I just read it quickly, I would say a lot of you have very similar lifestyles. First of all, you're teachers. A lot of your friends are from work. Most people have a social life that's somewhat involved with their church. A few of you mentioned farming. Some of you are involved with farming. And so that made it very interesting. So there were a lot of things you had alike. Now, one thing I came up with, I thought would make an interesting lesson, is you might say, well, life in a small town versus life in a big town, or even Lincoln or New York. But if you wanted to do a project with your students, depending on how old they are, and you could really do it with any age, because if we look at a lesson plan, is you could go on the internet and look for good quality YouTube videos where people introduce their town and what people do in their town. Now, I happened to focus on Japan, and I found one by a Japanese person, but it was not very long and not very detailed. But I found several by people living in Japan who are themselves speak English very well, or their wife or their spouse is Japanese, and they talk about living in their small town. And we always talk about Tokyo, but I thought, wouldn't it be interesting? What is it like to live in rural Japan? So this is how you make multicultural things really different. And it's interesting to me. I actually ended up watching those kind of videos for 2 hours. And it struck me as some of the differences, and you would see some of this yourself, is even though it doesn't include everything about life in the home, but it talks about how people get along in the village and what kind of the stores are, what are some of the rules about shopping, and the way the town looked. We usually see a park or something. I always notice in Nebraska you have a park and you have a place for the school, and really very clean and well kept. And in Japan they have very similar things, but it's a little, they even have deer in pens in some of the small parks, so people can go and talk to the deer or the animals. And it is very sedate, and they have a lot of woods, totally different than urban Japan. But what I really liked is how quiet and peaceful it was. And it was kind of rainy, and it kind of like being in the mountains a little bit. That's the way it is there. But it was very sedate, very relaxing, and not a lot of activity. Maybe they played computers at home, but outside, and there were no activities like you might see some sort of a game going on, a sports or something. But in the small towns, it was very quiet. And so kids would play, but it was very simple. And so I thought that might be a good little project, because they also have a lot of really ancient things. Even in little villages, they'll have shrines, beautiful little temples, either Zen, Buddhist, or Shinto temples. And then people will go there and pray, and they're very beautifully kept. And they're also kept very old. They keep it up, but you can tell these things are ancient. Some of them have been there for 500 years, 1,000 years. So there's a very different take on life there, and especially the way they drive. Different side of the road. They have a whole different set of values, different than us. So that'd be a good exercise. You could do that for Mexico. You could do it for other countries. And if you have Hispanic students in your class, or international students, you could find life in a small town in Sweden or Germany or El Salvador or Canada or anything like that. And there's a lot of interesting things. And small town to small town is not an obvious comparison. You have to really look and see what you find. So I wanted to share that. Now, here are some of my observations. I did write names down, but I don't want to name drop all through here, although I really had some good ones. I noticed one, Tim wrote about how when it comes to time, a lot of you mentioned this, your kids are in sports, they're in other activities, and you actually, when I call time, your time is very carefully controlled, but it's really not so much monochromatic as polychronic, because you're doing different things at different times. You're managing several activities that cross over into each other. And so a lot of times people traditionally say that women, or that because women traditionally were the mothers and took care of all these kids, they had so much activity going on. Like we have a daycare at our house, so there isn't such a thing as just one thing at a time. There's 4 or 5 activities going on. You don't really control the kids that well. I mean, they just move around, bursts of energy. And so I noticed that. I get to go home tonight and clean the floors. So I know they have different activities, like spilt ice cream, or not ice cream they were given by the way. Some they slipped out of the freezer. But in reading the descriptions, it was really interesting because the guys don't come off looking too good. I think this is mainly because I'm seeing the feminine viewpoint on, and because most of you in the class are women, that the guys seem like you have to move them around. They just don't get up and move. They'll be late or something, and you don't want to be late. And I was trying to play around with that in my mind, and I said, well, because you want to keep expectations. You want to be at the game on time, and certainly the athletes are there on time. But sometimes other people going along kind of come in late. You don't want to be late to church or definitely not late to school. That's just horrible. Also that, so I got the perspective because I didn't get a lot. Tim and, there's not a lot of guys in the class. I'm going to have to go count them up again. But it just struck me that what I enjoyed was the interaction was so strong. There's so many discussions. And you covered all kinds of things. The friendship, that loyalty, and that friendships are valuable, and you don't give them away. So you pick your friends carefully. A lot of times your friends and social relationships come from your work, sometimes from church, but maybe not as much from the neighborhood, although it depends on where you live and what the neighborhood's like. Titles, I wrote this note down that when people use a title, like when I go to the coffee shop, some of the baristas could be my students. Some will call me Glenn, and some will call me Dr. Tracy. And I used to note that. Now I kind of ignore it, but I notice that when people call me Glenn, and I've had students do that, I don't scold them. I don't say anything about it. I observe that they're trying to be a little naughty, trying to break the rules a little bit. Sometimes I end up being better friends with the people that call me by my first name than keep the distance. Dr. Tracy, I don't know. That's just something I observed. But when you talked about power relationships, that in small towns, everybody knows everybody on a first name basis, So it's different than it would be. But at school, maybe it's a little more formal. The word coach is interesting. I mean, coach can almost be a sign of affection. It's not like, it's respect in both, So those terms are really interesting to observe. Now, if you were to observe Japanese or another culture, you would observe that titles are kind of important and they stick with those. So, okay, and nature. I notice that most of you dealing with farms, you pray, but you're hopeful that things will work out with nature. I didn't notice anybody irrigating, so I guess everybody's at the mercy of the rain, too much or too little. Awareness of body language. Several of you teach that, and you teach the high school kids or middle school or whatever. that the way you do things and the look on your face is as important as what you say, because you can be disrespectful in other ways. Now, here's one that was really interesting. I want to do one lesser one before I get the last one. Collectivism versus the individual. Here's what my feeling about it is, that in Nebraska, or in most of your situations, and particularly in Hispanic culture, is that the family, or at least the group, or the people in the town, being within the confines of behaving properly and excelling in ways that they accept, like in academics or sports, or maybe business, you're a hard worker. Those things are very acceptable. But being different in other ways, that wasn't addressed. I mean, no one had any weird or unusual stories about individuals, because you really were talking about the central part of your life. And normally people don't bring that up. And most people, you seem so incredibly happy with your lives, which is good. I'm not being sarcastic. But it was interesting. It's like teachers are it's a very good job, because you get to work with people. It's intellectual. It's different. It's not the same every day. You usually don't get bored with it. It's a good source of income. It has a lot of positives. Your schedule's aligned with the school, and with, if you have kids, and once they're over 4 years old, they're in school too. So it's participatory for all. So the collective thing is very important in our culture. We always talk about individualism, but we only want it in certain ways. No one said, so-and-so is kneeling for the national anthem at the high school football game. That would not be acceptable. In some cultures, people wouldn't care. In other cultures, it's a big deal. But that's just one way you may not behave the right way. Maybe you don't kneel right or something at church, or sing outright, or participate. That would bother people too. So usually parents are usually pretty picky about how their kids behave, and they're aware other people have given a judgment of the parents by how their kids are. Even though at some point you have to realize you can't be responsible for everything. But as good parents, you try to be. Another thing I noticed was time, and I'm coming back to that because there's another aspect of time. One is the daily schedule, which is super much the present. What's going to happen next hour, next week. Not a lot of focus on the distant future or the distant past. There was a mention, I think Valeria mentioned her 4 generations, talking about life in Mexico, and there was some of you mentioning the 4 generations was the farming. I have to look up who that was, but the idea of thinking back, having the farm for 4 generations, or living in a house your grandparents were born in, really interesting stuff. But Nebraska, with the immigrant population 100 years ago, we're still pretty much dealing with just the recent past, or the pretty short distance into the future. So that's what we think of. We don't think of anything. There was one mention in here of somebody that had some friends that had died and had lost their son at 9 years old, and there wasn't a lot of negative stuff in any of this, but we do know mortality impacts us, and we want to keep a hopeful living for the present and the near future and in the long-term future of our kids, but we may not look at that very concretely. We just want to have good kids, and they're going to grow up, because that's how I think with my kids now to have a grandson. And are they safe? Are they doing okay, et cetera? So I'm really focused on mostly the next 5 years at the most, Those are some of my observations, but you could do other stuff with that. Now, I'm not going to drag this out a long time, but I did like some of the statements. Maddie, you mentioned about people welcoming you in. I remember that in several of these. about breaking into the local culture. Sometimes you have to be there 20, 30 years. Somebody mentioned that. And Emily, I had you down, you'd mentioned about, and I'd written this down about living for the present versus living for the future. And that we might encounter other cultures in small towns that really look backwards. They look at their ancestors. They think about their great grandparents and their grandparents. Very strong in many cultures, and even in some churches, knowledge of ancestral trees is big. It depends on where you're from. I think in the Day of the Dead, where people go and decorate the graves, I don't notice here, we have our Memorial Day, but I don't know, grief seems a very personal thing. It's not as public a thing. How hard it is to be part of a town, Lisa, you mentioned that too. And the big one is when towns have to, I forget which one it was, but somebody here mentioned about towns having to consolidate their schools, and that caused a lot of problems because those individual communities do have a very strong unity within them, and they expect loyalty to the town. Body language, Kimberly had a good mention there. I thought about something else, and Grace, you mentioned this. We have to look at how people are. You may be married and establish your family. You may be single. You may be in that transition stage as a young adult. And that's a different culture too. So I think that's very much worth thinking about. One of the most interesting things to look at in other cultures is dating, marriage. What are the rules? Some cultures have arranged marriages. I had students, very high status from India, that had arranged marriages. I couldn't believe it. I said, "How can you have an arranged marriage?" "Oh, it's much better that way." And I said, "Really?" Wow. Taylor had you talked about the present and the past, and I also had one mention here about what do we expect out of our lives? To be good people, to excel, to have a family. I mean, we have all these different goals, you and I have, and we share these. Are you settling for just being mediocre? Taylor mentioned this in one of her statements. And that you need to be working because you're just settling. And settling, people don't want to settle that, Settling is like when you get old and you have a choice of which nursing home and you have no choice, you settle. And that's not good. I think about that sometimes. I hope you never see me with anyhow, wheeling around in an old folks home. But that can happen. Important, connecting with local history is very important. I'm sorry, I'm just here's one interesting, and I like this from Cassie. Talk about farmers being the upper class, and that can be true. People don't realize wealth in farming is very big. And some of you say, no, that's not true. It depends, because I have relatives that lost their farms and relatives that became quite wealthy with their farms. Depends on how you judge wealth and stuff. It almost sounds like plantations sometimes. Well, anyhow, I think that's about all. Although, Valeria, I really liked yours talking about you could see in her right at the end, Valeria's talking about it's important to stabilize the family, and then you're kind of allowed to go and do your own thing. I thought that's interesting. It's very common in other cultures. Asian cultures, traditionally, the family, and especially the oldest patriarchy, usually the oldest man in the family, would have a lot of say about what the grandchildren are going to do. And the oldest son usually was obligated. We're almost going back Middle Ages, The oldest son would get the property and the money, but the oldest son was obligated too. They couldn't just go off and become an illustrator of valuable books or something in the Middle Ages. So there's that weeding out now, and that's really different dynamic now. in our culture. So anyhow, I'm talked too much. I'm trying to monitor the football game without listening to it on the radio. So you probably noticed I got off target there. 3-3 with 12 minutes left. What do you think? I still think Brady will pull it off, but I'm not really for either one of these teams. All right. Well, thank you. And I hope I gave you some ideas. I really enjoy these discussions.